1875, Kiamichi Mountains, Indian Territory. A storm front drags claws through the pine ridges. Needles hiss like rain, although the sky is bone dry. A broken wagon lies tilted against a black oak, its wheels still spinning, though no hand touched it. In the ravine below, quicksand gulps a boot and burps up a silver spur. Vultures circle low, counting breaths. Ellen Keene, widow 32, has one son left in this world, 14-year-old Thomas. A ranch heir swore to clear her debts, then sold her homestead contract to the Glass Gang. When Thomas is spotted carrying the family rifle, the gang gives chase into the woods they use as their private hunting ground. Ellen must risk the same forest where men vanish and names get erased from ledgers. If she fails, her boy is meat for wolves or worse, found by men who call themselves hunters. At dusk, a lone rider appears on the ridge above the ravine, hat brim slick with pine pitch. But the rider who appeared at dusk was no savior. Watch closely for the undertaker's ledger leaf with the scraped-off initials. When you see whose name was erased from that page, you'll understand why the outlaws always hunted this forest and why Thomas was never meant to leave it. The day began at a pine box grave, cut into stubborn clay. The wind kept trying to close the lid on the world. Ellen stood with her hands folded and her jaw aching from not crying. A short cross was carved from fence slats and stuck at the head, letters burned with a poker. Jonah Keene. The letters looked like brands on a steer. The preacher's words were thin and hurried. There were coyotes somewhere beyond the ridge, and the men wanted to be down the hill before dark. Caleb Ransom waited in a dark coat that didn't pick up dust. He held a folded paper with a red ribbon, like a wound tied shut. When the last clod hit wood with a hollow thud, he stepped close and offered the paper and a pen. He said it was mercy, a gentleman's mercy. He would clear the debt if she signed the transfer and allowed his men to help her hold the land until spring. His voice was smooth and had the tone of a storekeeper counting out sugar. Ruthie Vale watched from behind the preacher's shoulder with eyes that did not settle. She had ink on her fingers and a soft bruise on her wrist that she tried to hide by gripping her shawl. Ellen looked at the paper and did not read it. Her thumb had a smear of dirt under the nail from touching the coffin lid a last time. She signed because the shovel handles were splintered and the sky was large and savage, and she had a boy to feed. The pen nib caught on the K and tore the paper slightly. Caleb smiled a small merchant's smile and pressed the tear flat with his white thumb. Talon Redbird stood farther up the hill, half in the trees, looking like part of the bark. He touched 2 fingers to his hat in a way that did not draw attention and listened to the wind move over the needles. He had come because Jonah Keene had once hauled him out of a ditch after soldiers had lost their map and their patience, and a man did not let a debt rot. He did not step forward at the grave. He waited for the dust to settle, because the dead dislike footsteps over them while their ears are still open. By evening, Ellen walked the fence line alone and felt the first shape of fear. Thomas had gone to fetch a kettle he'd left at the creek and had taken the family rifle, because you did not walk anywhere without iron once the glass men began circling the hills. The wind drew the smoke of Caleb's men away from the big house and the high windows and carried it down toward her crooked gate. She watched the smoke lean like a pointing finger. She remembered Jonah laughing when the gate stuck, remembered how he'd said you could tell if a family was honest by the squeak of their gate. Her throat burned, and she swallowed the memory like a coal. Talon came out of the trees at her shoulder, so soft she did not flinch. He told her the forest had rules here. He spoke plainly, as if teaching a child to cross a stream. If she saw little pieces of glass or bright wire hanging like ornaments, those were kill marks. If she saw carved owls on bark, those were false eyes that watched for anyone who believed in luck. He said the glass men salted the trail with toys and left them at child height because cruelty liked to measure itself. He told her never to whistle after dark and never to answer her name if the wind called it. She said she had a son out with a kettle and a rifle. He nodded. He said, "Go to ground. then move. Never stay in the open while the sky is loud. His voice had something like sorrow deep behind it, but the words were sharp as nails. They heard hounds before they saw flames. The first sound was the hollow bark of a dog that had run too far and found scent it wanted to brag about. Then came the chuff of men, and the crackle of pine pitch torches, and a voice that liked shouting its own name. The wind turned hard and threw Ellen's fear into her own face. Like ash, she ran for the lower path and felt the ground tilt. She had run these trails as a girl, but time and grief change a map. Talon grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the limestone sink. He smudged ash on her boots and sometimes on her cheeks with the heel of his hand. He told her to breathe through the stitch in her side and not to look back when she heard the hounds go quiet, because they were testing the air, and so was she. Sheriff Abram Pike rode out from town with his hat low and his mouth set tight, telling himself the paper in his pocket gave him law. He had a clean pen stroke and a family that needed flour, and Caleb Ransom's men kept flour behind a locked door. He had signed things before. He told Ellen when she stumbled into the road that he would escort her to safety. He lifted his hand like a blessing and gestured with his reins toward the low logging road that cut back toward Ransom's corral. Ellen had always been polite to him. There was a time when he had tipped his hat to her husband and meant it. He felt sick in his stomach when she started to follow, and even sicker when he saw the torch flare ahead where the road bent. He said a word he did not say in church and pulled his horse across the road like a clumsy gate. Ellen did not stop. She vaulted the culvert and slid on her side beneath the brush, picking up bark splinters in her palms. A torch swayed like a pendulum above the ditch. Sheriff Pike sat frozen until the men there laughed and told him he looked pale. Thomas Keene did not feel like a boy carrying a rifle. He felt like someone pretending to be a boy who carried a rifle in a story that had already been told. He had Jonah's hatchet at his belt, worn smooth by his father's hand. He felt its weight and took comfort in it, the way a child treasures a broken toy. He saw the hounds first, as dark slices between trunks. He thought of stories where wolves were smarter than men, and then understood men had taught these animals how to be cruel for them. He doubled back toward the ravine, where the mud swallowed sound. He moved the way his father had taught him, rolling his foot and keeping his weight low. He did not whistle. He did not call out. He counted the breaths of the hounds and counted his own. When he crossed a shallow cut in the earth, he saw a line of bright glass winking at knee height. He stopped. The glass trembled in the wind like a string of charms. He went under it on his belly and smelled the sharp of pitch from torches on the wind's tongue. Silas Glass rode the ridge like a butcher measuring a carcass. He liked to look down at people so he could imagine where their bones bent. He had a face made for smiling, and it made people forget his eyes. He wore Jonah Keene's hat because it fit. He told himself it fit like blood. He saw Ellen move through brush like a deer that had learned to hate noise. He lifted a rag as if he were signaling mercy to a stranger on a burning roof. He waited until she looked up and saw her eyes change shape. He liked that moment and had felt it before with other faces. His horse shifted and the saddle creaked like a hinge. He touched the brim of Jonah's hat and tilted it against the bloodless light. Ellen's breath stopped as if someone pinched shut a pipe inside her chest. She saw the hat before she saw the man. She had patched the sweatband of that hat. She had set it on a peg and heard Jonah hum while he washed up. The brim was dark with pitch now, slick as if it had been dipped in the forest's oil. The man under it lifted his head, and she saw teeth and a kind of pleased patience. She didn't scream. A scream would only tell the dogs where the heart was. She dropped into the brush again and felt thorns write quick lines on her skin. The rider tracked her with nothing but the slow turn of his wrist and the little smile. The wind flattened her hair against her skull, and the sound of the forest felt crowded, like a room with too many men standing in it. Night took the color out of everything and gave it back as shape and movement. Talon guided Ellen down into a limestone maw that had eaten fire and rain for 100 years. He pushed a pile of needles over their footprints and used a dead branch to sweep behind. He blew ash from his hand and rubbed it over her boots again, then over his own. He told her in a low voice that ash confuses a hound because it steals the oil from the scent, the way grief steals taste from food. His voice was steady. He told her they would wait until the dogs committed to the wrong fork. She nodded and held her mouth shut, so she would not gulp. Every gulp sounded loud to her ears. Talon told her a story in a short rope of words. He said the woods remember a name if it is carved into them right, and sometimes they return what is owed. He did not use the old word for the helpers that move, as breath moves, because he had learned the white men's ears break when they try to repeat it. Far off, a dog yelped, and then choked off as if someone had touched its throat. Talon tilted his head. He smelled water in the stone. He said the ravine below would be bad ground because it swallows feet and gives up coins to lure men who think luck runs downhill. He told her to roll her sleeves and smear mud at her wrists. He showed her the scar on his own wrist, a pale crescent set there by a soldier's rope. He said a scar like that teaches you to watch for lines in the air. Ruthie Vale moved through the town, like someone who carried her own lamp. She had been told she was pretty since she was 12, and had learned early it meant something other than beauty. She knew where Caleb kept his iron box, and which key went to which lock. She had dipped her pen in ink and copied men's names on pages until the letters stopped being people and became a game the rich played. Still, she kept a small book under her bed, with her own name on the first page and the names of 2 infants after it, and she kissed her fingers and touched those names before she slept. She saw Sheriff Pike step into the mission cellar and watched him hesitate. She followed him there, soft as a breath, and found him staring at a sealed file with wax that had the ransom crest pressed in. He looked like a man who had found his own name on a bill he could not pay. Pike read the label because reading was what he did when his hands shook. Coroner's inquest, it said, on a stillborn infant, marked Thomas Silas. The date made his mouth go dry. He put his ear to the quiet of the mission and heard nothing but the old stone settling. He thought of Ellen and how she had nodded at him today with politeness, like a shield, and how his wife had pressed a coin into his palm for flour and told him to be a man. He slipped the file back into its slot because men were coming down the hall and because some doors close faster than others. Thomas moved along a run of rock where lichens made slick coins. He hugged the rifle close and tried to listen with more than ears. He was afraid, but the fear thinned out and left something sharper that made him careful. He saw a shape hanging from a branch, a small thing. He wanted to step closer because it looked like a locket, and his mind jumped to his mother's throat and the way she tucked a chain into her dress when she was thinking hard. He crouched and reached, and then stopped, because the air near the locket had a humming to it, the way a hornet's nest sounds when hidden behind lath. He peered and saw the fine hair of a tripline, nearly invisible, drawn taut to a spring pole. He felt his stomach drop, as if the ground had tilted under him. He did not move for 10 breaths. Then he took Jonah's hatchet and reached up slow and cut the locket free. The line hummed and sang, and then went quiet. He opened the locket in his palm. Inside was a curl of baby hair, faded to the color of old wheat, and under it the letters EK scratched and then scraped at with something sharp. He closed his hand and felt heat rise to his eyes in the cold night. Ellen and Talon climbed out of the sink when the hounds drifted east. The air tasted of pitch and the burnt sugar smell of a pine torch. They moved cross-slope, keeping the ravine always at their left shoulder, the way Talon told her. He said a crooked line confuses a straight man. He stopped once and pressed his finger to a knot on a pine. He tied a thin strip of cloth there, not bright but deliberate, and breathed on it once. Ellen watched his hands and thought how they moved like a man wrapping a child for warmth. She believed nothing and everything at once. In that moment, they came to a snare tree that had taken more than it gave. There were old loop marks in the bark and a stain like rust along one root. At eye height hung a paper square, hard, with grease, an old wagon inventory slip, the kind teamsters tacked to crates, wire, pitch, springs. The letters were plain. Ellen reached up and touched the paper and left a small mark where her finger had pressed. She did not know she had done it. Far off, someone laughed with a sound like a bell swung too hard. Ruthie found Ellen in the shallow hollow where the old Sawyer's camp had been, and knelt without asking. She had run, and her hair had slipped its pin and made a dark line along her cheek. She told Ellen in a rush that the homestead pages had been recopied and that her name had been moved from owner to occupant with a flourish of the wrist. She said she had done it when Caleb pressed his ring into her shoulder and told her that not every woman earned a roof the honest way. Her voice trembled and then got calm, as if it had stepped from one room to another. She said there was a missing baptism line in Sister Mercy's register, a line erased with pumice stone so clean that nothing remained but the faintest groove. She said the sponsor name had been S. Glass. She said she thought Jonah Keene and Silas Glass had both claimed the same infant once, and that Caleb had ordered the erasure because inheritance could ruin a tidy ledger. Ellen stared at her and felt her stomach lift and fall like a boat on a river she had not wished to cross. Talon listened with his eyes half closed and did not change his breathing. Sheriff Pike sat at his desk and tried to write a deposition that would not turn into smoke when it met daylight. He wrote that Thomas Keene had stolen a registered horse that belonged to Caleb Ransom and had fled into the Kiamichi under cover of night, armed and dangerous. His hand wrote it clean and firm, the way his teachers had liked. Sweat ran into his collar and chilled his back. He stared at the sentence and imagined it carved into stone. He saw a rope in his mind and a boy's feet not quite touching dust. He picked up a second sheet and began to write a different document, a thing that was not a deposition and not a confession, just words stitched together like someone fixing a tear by lamplight. He folded that second page and slid it into his jacket, where his heart made it damp. Silas worked the hounds down and sent 2 of his men ahead with poles. He told them to keep the lines low because fear makes people duck, and you catch them quicker at the throat if the line is whisper high. He told a joke about boys who play soldier and men who never learned the game, and the men laughed with their mouths and kept their eyes on the trees. Thomas reached a small clearing that felt wrong, the way a room feels wrong when a stranger has been in it. The grass lay flat in places where it should not. There were 3 saplings staked the same direction, unnatural, as if a hand had combed the field. He stood at the edge and held the rifle tight. He was tired now, and the tired did not feel like bedtime tired. It felt like a hunger that had moved into his bones. He took a step because the path narrowed, and because he needed to keep moving forward to stay alive. He lifted his foot and saw the line too late, a thin horsehair tight as a fiddle string. It kissed his boot and responded like a living thing, and he heard the air change voice above him. Ellen froze because the night itself changed shape. Talon hissed once through his teeth, the way a man does when a knife slips. They were still too far to reach Thomas in one dash, and the field between was full of quiet tricks. Talon lowered his shoulder and slid along the ground, pulling himself with his elbows like a snake that had learned to be a man. Ellen started to move with him, but he reached back and squeezed her ankle and shook his head. He lifted the small knife from his belt with 2 fingers and set it down on the ground in front of him, then moved, slow as age, toward the shadow where his eyes told him the knot must be tied. The line tightened at Thomas's throat and lifted a little, but not enough to cut off air. The device had been set by someone who liked to watch a boy panic. It allowed breath and promised something worse. He stopped moving. He remembered a story Jonah told about a snare that only killed when the animal fought it. He stood very still, and his eyes burned, and his hands trembled so hard the rifle tapped once against his leg. He tasted metal. He did not scream. He said in a hoarse voice that could not choose if it was a child's or a man's voice, "Ma." Silas listened to the clearing breathe. He smiled, not big, just enough for himself. He walked forward on the path his own men had memorized, the way a gambler memorizes where the queen hides. He lifted the torch and held it high and watched the line catch flame for an instant and then go black again. He liked that trick. He felt the hat on his head as a weight that belonged. He thought about brothers, and how one always steals the other's best thing. He did not think the word jealousy. He thought only possession. Talon's knife edge found the knot in the dark, by knowing where a hand would have to reach to tie such a thing. He cut once and then again, barely touching the line at Thomas's throat. He felt the tension give like a breath leaving. He did not pull the loop off. He let the slack fall back in place, because a smart trap can feel a sudden absence. He flicked the line over the small peg that would have cinched it and let it rest there. He touched Thomas's hand and pressed his fingers twice in a pattern that meant hold. Thomas did not know the pattern, but he understood anything that gentle in a night like this meant mercy. A sound moved through the trees behind Silas, a clacking like bone on bone. A wind toy hung from an old limb, talked once, and then was still. Silas did not look back. He was not a man who looked back often. Ellen watched him from the brush and had a thought she had never had about another person. She thought, he will not change. The thought was clean and cold as well water. Ruthie ran again with her shawl flapping and reached Sister Mercy at the mission gate. Mercy had soot on her cheek from the stove and a ribbon of gray in her hair that had not been there last spring. Ruthie asked for the register, and Mercy hesitated. The book was not for running. It was for holding steady in a world that ran. Ruthie said a boy's neck would soon feel a rope if they did not hurry. Mercy closed her eyes and asked the Virgin to forgive her, then took the key from her belt. The register lay on its shelf and seemed to weigh more than paper. They opened it to the middle, where the erased line looked like a healed scar. Mercy touched the groove with one finger and felt her stomach twist. She said the sponsor had been S. Glass. She said the mother's name had been written, then rewritten, then rubbed to dust. She could not swear by the father's name, because the hands that scraped had known their business. Ruthie took a torn scrap that had been used once as blotting paper and held it up to the light. There was a shadow of a letter on it, faint as a breath on a window. It could have been a J. It could have been a lie pretending to be a J. They stood in the candle smell and did not try to name it out loud. Sheriff Pike rode toward the pines, because sometimes a man has to choose a side, even if both sides use the same paper. He had the sealed file under his coat and the deposition in his pocket and a revolver that he had cleaned too many times. He saw torchlight through the branches. He heard men's voices rising and falling in the old rhythm of cruelty, disguised as work. He thought of the boy Thomas and felt the ghost of his own son's hand, the boy buried years ago when the fever had taken his name and his voice in the same night. He urged his horse forward and said very softly, "Not this time." The clearing held its breath. Thomas felt the loop loosen, as if a hand had decided not to tighten. He closed his eyes. He opened them again and saw the torchlight touch steel, and then a face came into the glow that was not his mother's and not the scout's. It was Silas Glass, and the hat on his head was a piece of Thomas's own past perched, like a crow, on a gallows. Silas lifted his chin and used a voice that slid into ears and stuck there like burrs. He said, "Boy, come to your uncle and I'll spare your ma." The word uncle struck Thomas with the force of a thrown stone. He did not move. His throat burned where the line had kissed it. His eyes blurred and cleared. He looked at the man's mouth to see if it would lie again, or if it had just told the one truth it had saved for sport. Ellen's hand landed on the ground beside Talon's and pressed. Her fingers dug into the earth. She wanted to spring and tear and end it. Talon shook his head once. The movement said, "Not yet." Silas took one step closer, and the line that Talon had eased trembled in the torchlight like a living vein. The dogs paced, confused by ash and crooked paths. Caleb Ransom's men were not yet there, but the forest could feel them on the far slope, the way a man senses thunder before the ear names it. The night narrowed to one breath and one step. Thomas's heel hovered. The loop's slack remembered its purpose. The clear sky felt heavy, and the pines leaned in like a jury ready to speak. Thomas's heel settled and did not take the weight. The loop quivered like a hungry thing denied. Silence seemed to grow fur on the trees. Silas smiled again, patient, letting the word uncle hang in the air like bait. Thomas thought of his father's hands teaching him the knot on a fish line, and how Jonah had said, "Never pull hard, unless you know what knot you're holding." He did not pull the loop. He did not move toward the voice. He said nothing, because a clean silence can be louder than a boy's cry. Talon's fingers pressed the dirt twice against Thomas's boot, as if knocking at a closed door. The knife edge touched the whisper peg and lifted it free a hair's width. The loop slackened another breath. Ellen held herself so still, her bones ached. The torch hissed. Somewhere a hawk that slept in daylight twitched and stamped on its branch as if it dreamed of falling. Silas took another step, careful as a cat on a shelf full of breakables. He talked in that warm way certain men have when they sell cruelty as kinship. He told Thomas about a rifle stock carved with a small notch under the comb, and how a man with the initials J.K. had set his thumb there every time he sighted a nail from fencing distance. He described the scar on Jonah's knuckle from a bucking colt, and the way Jonah laughed through nose and teeth at the same time. He told these things like a man counting coins he kept in his pocket. Thomas felt the details land in him and recognized their shape. He tasted the salt of his own mouth and kept still. The loop sighed and slid down to touch the blood-warm skin at his throat and rested there like a broken promise. Talon snapped the second thread of the snare with a movement so light it seemed like a breath, then laid the slack over his forearm so it would not jump. He mouthed a word that Ellen could not hear and might not have understood if she had. Thomas blinked because suddenly there was air enough to breathe and thinking was possible again. He did not stagger. He let the line hang like he had never been caught at all. A dog nosed the edge of the clearing and sneezed, baffled by ash and mud and something else that smelled like knots and river stones. Silas's smile thinned when he saw no panic. He did not like it when the game did not jump. Sheriff Pike eased into the brush on the high side, keeping his revolver low and his breathing shallow. He saw the boy in the glimmer of torchlight, saw the filament-thin line at the throat, and the poise that did not belong to 14 years. He saw Ellen flat to the ground, with rock dust on her cheek, and the Choctaw scout holding the knight in his hand like a tool. He recognized Silas's profile and the set of his shoulders in Jonah Keene's hat. He felt something old in himself grind against who he had been this morning. He shifted his boot, and a twig sounded like a pistol crack, and in that small noise the scene tightened again. Silas flicked his eyes toward the sound, and then back, as if he had eyes everywhere. He called softly for his men by name, not loud, just enough to snake into the brush and make hearts hitch. 2 shadows moved, one to either flank. He lifted his torch toward Thomas's face and studied him the way a man studies a horse before buying it. "All that fuss," he said, voice mild, "and you just needed to hear the truth. Blood talks. Men lie, papers lie, pastors lie, but blood keeps a better ledger." His hand turned, showing the palm, and the torchlight caught the wedding ring he wore on a leather thong. It was a woman's ring. It had not been Ellen's. It made her stomach go cold anyway. Thomas found his voice and discovered it was deeper than yesterday. "Uncle," he said, making the word dry, as if testing a new boot for stones. He felt foolish and brave at once. He did not move toward Silas. He asked, "Whose brother then?" The words cost him more breath than they should have, and came out ragged. Silas's eyes brightened, the way a card-sharp's eyes brighten when the table is almost cleared. "The one lying with dirt in his teeth and that hat on his peg," he said, and touched the brim above his brow, as if to tip it in respect to the dead he had robbed. Ellen felt anger rise like heat from a stove. She did not speak, because the anger wanted to say too much and too loud. Talon's head turned half an inch. His eyes were soft in the firewash. He murmured low enough that only the dirt heard him, and said it was time to move this game to a court that knew older laws. He flicked the broken loop off the peg with a nail and let it fall down Thomas's chest, like a surrendered snake. Thomas swallowed carefully and felt skin cool. He took 1 half-step sideways, and then another, still inside the trap's geometry but no longer ruled by it. He did not understand the old law words, but he understood traps. A gust shouldered the trees, and the wind toy spoke again, a short clatter like teeth. Silas's smile faltered. He had a superstition he never admitted that said dead men in living forests have an ear for boasting. He thrust the torch toward one flanker and snapped fingers for the other to go wide. Pike heard the snap, recognized it as a count, and knew if the second man cleared that cedar, he would see Ellen, and the game would be over in the ugly way these things end. Pike stood up. He did it like a man standing at the front of a church, strange with fear, and sure anyway. "Silas," he said, and his voice was tired and full. "You call that a court? You don't know the first thing about law." He held the revolver in both hands like a prayer and aimed at the shadow on the right, not at Silas. The shadow froze. The torch shook a little in the other man's grip. Silas tilted his head. "Sheriff," he said, as if greeting someone who had just remembered his invitation. "Come to stamp some seals?" Pike could smell the pitch and the dog, and the sour fear that thickens under arms. He said, "Put your men back." He did not raise his voice. He did not look at Ellen. He said to the dark, "Boy, when my hand drops, you run to the pine with the ribbon on it, and keep that tree between you and the torches." Thomas's eyes darted to the ribbon he would not have seen on his own. Talon's hand was already moving to cut the last of the snares around the clearing, so they could pass in any direction, without a whisper string giving warning. Silas sucked air through his teeth. "You're writing checks your badge can't cash, Abram," he said softly, and pointed his torch to the badge where light gleamed off brass. Pike did not answer. He lowered the revolver a fraction. The man on the right felt power, returned to his arms, and took a step. Pike fired once. The torch leaped out of that hand and rolled, painting the clearing in tumbling light. The man screamed, not from the wound, but from the surprise of hearing the world talk back. Everything moved then, because movement was promised and finally delivered. Thomas broke for the ribboned pine, legs light and throat raw. Ellen was beside him in 3 heartbeats, hand on his back, not pushing, just there. Talon swiped the slack loop off Thomas's neck and stuffed it into his own belt, as if it were a receipt for a debt about to be paid. Silas lunged and met a line he had forgotten his own men had set, a knee-high trip meant for a running back. He did not fall, because his pride kept him upright, but his stride stuttered, and his next step landed heavy and wrong. Pike shot again and hit a torch so that sparks splashed like fireflies. Dogs went wild, untrained for chaos they had not created. They vanished into the black seam between 2 pines, moving uphill instead of down, because Talon knew fear runs down, and hunters run down, and old law courts sit above. They did not run mad. They moved with purpose, wasting no breath. Behind them came shouts, and then silence, which was worse, because it meant the men were listening or smiling. They reached the limestone sink they had used, and Talon did not go in. He had no interest in repeating a move under eyes that had been taught. He slashed a new sign at knee height on a cedar, where no torch would show it, and dragged a branch to rough up their passage, then swung them left toward an old widowmaker pine that he knew by a lightning scar. "Widow's pine," he said aloud, naming it to make it real in everyone's head at once. "If we must fight, let's do it under a witness who has stood a while." Ellen took the word witness like a drop of water. They paused in a hollow, where the ground smelled like old leaves and iron. Talon crouched and unwound a narrow strap from his bundle. He tied a knot around Ellen's wrist, very light, not to bind, but to connect. Then he tied a matching knot around Thomas's wrist. A mirror. He told them in a soft voice. The knots were not magic tricks. They were reminders that their bodies were still their own, that the forest touched skin but did not own it. Thomas nodded as if that claim gave him a spine. Ellen asked, quiet, "Are you with us because of Jonah?" Talon looked at her and did not dodge. "Because of him," he said, and then added, "and because of a boy I didn't save when soldiers paid me to point." He did not blink. She understood more than the words said. Ruthie and Sister Mercy moved through the mission, like ghosts, who still remembered to shut doors. Mercy fetched a small lantern and wrapped cloth around the glass to dim it. Ruthie slid the torn parish leaf into a narrow pocket sewn into her skirt hem. She looked at Mercy's face and saw a resolve that had not been there when they stitched altar linens together. Mercy said, "A book is no use if the names in it are lies." They both knew the danger of carrying any paper outside, especially paper that touched men's pride. They went anyway. The night took them in and gave them mice sounds and the far-off crack of shots to taste like grit between teeth. Caleb Ransom stood on his porch and watched his men's torches make a living collar around the lower slope. He had his cloak on against a chill he did not want to admit. He wondered if his cattle would be spooked by the gun noise and if he could bill the county for losses. He flicked a silver coin into the air and caught it with his palm closed. He liked the thud of money hitting flesh. A boy from the bunkhouse ran up with a lathered horse and stammered that the sheriff had drawn on one of Silas's men. Caleb smiled in a careful way and said, "Of course he did." He took down a different rifle than the one he kept for show. His mouth thinned. He thought of Ruthie with her quick hands and how he had trained them to be useful. He did not know she was in the trees walking toward a different use. They reached the widow's pine, a great tree that had survived more winters than any man living. Lightning had eaten a strip of its bark years ago. The wound had healed over in a sliding scar that looked like a river's bend. Talon showed them old pegs hammered into the trunk, black with age, the kind of pegs men use when they hang things that should not swing. Ellen touched one with a fingertip and pulled her hand back, as if pricked. Talon said, "Here." He did not say more. Sometimes the right place tells you what to do. He began to lay a court. He sent Thomas to gather fist-sized stones from the slope, and Ellen to collect dry needles and a strip of bark that would smoke if warmed. He strung 3 thin lines at different heights along the approaches, each line set to sing a different note when brushed. He placed a flat of loose gravel on a board just under dark ferns, so one heavy tread would spill the stones and shout to the night without a voice. He showed Thomas how to stack rocks in a sly little cairn that would roll and scatter when kicked, marking a guilty foot for a tracker to read at dawn. Ellen brought the needles with a face that was calmer than an hour ago. She put them where he pointed and used the ribboned pine knot as the heart of the shape they were making. Pike found them there, teeth chattering, not from cold, but from the new way his life felt to him. He lifted the sealed mission file from his jacket and pressed it into Ellen's hands. She held it like a hot pan, and then, like a baby, the wax was unbroken. She saw the stamp and understood why her stomach had curdled earlier. She did not break the seal. Pike said, "Don't open it yet. It is a bullet I need to fire at the right time." He also took out his deposition, the lie he had signed, and he used the point of his penknife to scratch a line across his name, not to erase it, but to mark it as wrong. He pricked his finger with the same knife and dragged a line of blood across the scratch, then folded the paper and gave that to Ellen too. "In case I can't speak when it matters," he said. Ellen nodded once, a movement made for graves and kitchens both. Ruthie and Mercy reached the lower slope and saw 2 of Caleb's men pissing in the brush like dogs. Ruthie stepped between trees, moving like a girl who had learned where men do not look. Mercy kept to the shadow side of trunks and prayed without words. Ruthie made the last 20 yards on the balls of her feet and slid the torn parish leaf into a slit on the side of Caleb's saddlebag where the leather had stretched. When the horse shifted, the paper whispered a secret to itself and then went still. The forest shifted temperature, as if a door had opened to a colder room. Talon felt it first, but Ellen noticed it too, the way the hairs on her forearm lifted. He finished the last line, the one set to sing just louder than breathing, and crouched in the shadow of the pine's great roots. He looked at Thomas and said, "You will have to stand." Thomas said he knew. He did not know until he said it. Ellen touched her son's cheek and felt the old softness that had survived the new sharpness. "If I tell you to run, you run," she said. He nodded. He did not say he would not. He did not promise anything that might break his mouth. They heard Silas before they saw flame. He did not shout his name this time. He came quiet, as a man making up a story. He wonders if others will believe. The men on his flanks moved with him, and behind those men came others, with the slow confidence of property following its owner. The first line sang, a high note like a string on a toy guitar. Silas stopped and smiled in the dark. "Clever," he said, not unkindly, as if praising a child's trick. He nudged the nearest man to go ahead of him. That man's foot slid the secret board, and the loose gravel ran like water. Pebbles pelted leaves. The dogs went stiff and stared, confused by rock rain. Ellen smiled with her teeth held shut. Silas advanced to the second line. It lay at waist height, a whisper over his belt, tuned to a lower note that thrummed in bone. It sang in that register men feel when thunder is still 5 ridges away. He stopped again, head bent, touched the line with a fingertip, and felt it hum. "You learned from my forest," he said to the dark. "I like a student." He put his hand aside and kept walking, ducking the line. A third line waited at shin height, 2 steps further, and his boot caught and stung. He did not fall. He killed a man once for falling in front of him, and had trained his ankles since. He stepped into the ring of the widow's pine with not one device left unseen. Talon admired him for a breath, and promised himself not to admire him again. He kept his knife low. Pike stepped out opposite Silas, gun in his right hand, and the sealed file heavy in his left coat. "Silas," he said, and his voice was public, "you are under arrest for unlawful hunting, and for attempted kidnap, and for—" Silas laughed, because the list would be long, and men who have done a lot of harm do not like to be bored by it. "Abram," he said, "put away the words. This is a family talk." Thomas stepped from behind the root shadow and into the moon's white. He did it slow enough that the act had dignity. He held no rifle in his hands. He had set it back where a line could not grab it. He had Jonah's small hatchet tucked under his belt at the spine, in a way Jonah had shown him. He said, "Silas, not Mr., not Sir, and not Uncle." Torches flared with a shared breath. Men sucked air and straightened, because a child saying a name like that makes grown-ups remember courtrooms and gallows, even if they have never seen either. Thomas's voice did not crack. He said, "You tell me you are blood. Then come stand in the light and say my father's name while you wear his hat." Silas's smile softened, in that way it did when he wanted to bring people closer, the way sweet milk brings a stray cat. He took 1 step forward and stopped, because a low rattle spoke under his boot, a bag of small bones tied to a peg. He looked down and lifted his foot, and the rattle stopped. He looked up and lifted both hands slow, to show he meant peace for now. He said, "Jonah." He did not add the last name right away. He held the first name out like a coin to see if the boy would take it. Thomas did not move. Ellen breathed through her nose, the way a midwife taught her long ago. Pike said, "Caleb Ransom sold the paper that put this boy in your path. You and he made a market of a widow's roof." He took the sealed file from his coat and raised it so the wax caught moonlight. "And you share more than a taste for money." Silas watched the wax, as if it were a beetle baiting a hook. He made no move to lunge. He knew the sheriff could shoot, and did not plan to catch a bullet for a file he had not read. He wanted the boy's face more than a page. He said, "Abram, open it, and if the truth in there says what I say, you hand the boy over like a good clerk, and we go home." Torchlight thickened through the trees as new men approached. Ellen heard tack clink and the quiet beat of hooves. Caleb Ransom's voice came before Caleb, smooth as a parlor, and wrong in the woods. He did not shout. He said, "Nobody opens anything until I'm present." He walked into the ring holding a torch that did not smoke because it was made of better cloth and better pitch. He had 2 cowhands with him, who wore tin stars that had been pinned to their vests after supper, a trick of jurisdiction that made men feel safe about their worst ideas. Caleb smiled at Ellen as if they were at his table sharing pie. He said, "You sign quick, Mrs. Keene, and I help quicker. Why didn't you come home when Abram offered?" He turned his face to the sheriff and let disappointment sit there like a stain. Mercy came up the far side and stayed hidden. Ruthie slid low and put her hand flat on the ground to feel where the men walked. She felt the thud of Caleb's heavy boot and the light step of a man whose feet had learned stealth by doing harm, and she knew which was which without seeing. She looked at Thomas standing straight and felt an ache go through her that had nothing to do with men's claims and everything to do with babies she had held. Pike lifted his voice the way a man lifts a chair to keep it between him and a bear. "Caleb," he said, "you sold a homestead contract in violation of county law, and you did it to the benefit of a known outlaw. You've deputized ranch hands to call it mercy." He held the sealed file higher. "And you ordered this paper made and sealed to cover a sin, not to record a death." Caleb's eyes cooled a shade. "Careful," he said. "Words rolled downhill can crush the man who set them rolling." He looked at Ruthie's empty left hand, and then at the faint line of a leaf corner peeking from his saddlebag, where no one but an attentive woman would notice it. He moved a hand casually to close the bag. Ruthie's pulse jumped once, and then steadied. Mercy's hand found her wrist and squeezed. Silas, impatient of talk that did not end with what he wanted, took another step. The third singing line brushed his belt and hummed again, a note of warning. He smiled like a man hearing a favorite tune. He said, "Boy, come to your uncle, and the rest of these crows can argue paper till the sun pushes them into holes." Thomas spoke before Ellen could. He said, "You wear my father's hat like it's yours," and reached up to his own head, where no hat sat, and made the motion of tipping a brim, an empty gesture that made every man there aware of absence. "If you want me to take a step," Thomas said, "say his whole name and why you felt welcome in his things." Silas did not move for one count, and in that count, Ellen saw him choose between pride and manipulation. He chose the second because pride is heavy and manipulation travels light. He said, "Jonah Keene," and made each vowel round and respectful. He said, "Blood of my blood. We were boys who cut our thumbs to make it true. He sired you, and I was there to swear it if papers asked. Papers didn't ask, so we made our own court." Ellen shut her eyes and opened them. She remembered Jonah and Silas at a distance from years ago, men with shoulders back and voices that carried, and how Jonah had stopped laughing when he talked with Silas, how something in him drew closer to the ground after those conversations. She did not need a file to know some of this could be true, and some could be the way liars lace truth through a thicker rope of lies. Talon's voice slid out from the pine, quiet as a whetstone on steel. "Better court than this stands waiting," he said. "Widow's pine will judge. Come under and speak your full names and why you hunt." He had set the ring so any man stepping fully into it would be framed by pegs and shadow and could not feel alone. Silas liked being central. He stepped in fully, head high. Caleb hung back, calculating where a torch could cast someone else's shadow and where his own would look thin. Pike lowered the file an inch and held it in the crook of his arm, muzzle of his revolver tracking the jerky man to Silas's right, who wanted to prove himself. Mercy slipped nearer Ellen and pressed the folded parish leaf into her palm with a whisper Ellen barely heard. "Sponsor S. Glass." Ruthie touched Thomas's elbow, once the way women do when men are being loud, and a boy needs to know he is still seen. Talon began to speak the old way, naming the tree, naming the ground, naming the people present by what they carried, as much as by their mouths. He named Ellen as the woman who had chosen mud over clean boots to keep a boy's throat whole. He named Thomas as the boy who stood in a ring meant for men and did not stoop. He named Pike as the man who had signed a lie and come anyway. He named Ruthie as the hand that had forged names and then tried to forge a path out of that work. He named Mercy as the bookkeeper of souls who had stepped outside the shelf. He named Caleb as a man with money and a soft cough who bought paper instead of fence posts. He named Silas as one who made forests forget names and then writ them back crooked. The naming changed the air. It made the lantern light feel heavier. It made everyone suddenly aware of their feet. Silas clapped slowly because mockery is a shield. "Pretty," he said, and then cut his hands off mid-clap because a set of hounds on his left went quiet in a way that meant they had seen the edge of a hole they remembered. The earth remembered too. Somewhere a stone slipped in its bed. Talon's trap with the loose gravel held its breath. Caleb said, "This is far enough. "Sheriff, disarm the boy and hand him over to me for safekeeping. The court can sort the rest when we have coffee." Pike laughed once, a hard sound. He said, "You've never given away anything for safekeeping that you didn't sell later." He raised the sealed file above his head and said, in a voice that did not shake, "Caleb Ransom ordered a false coroner's inquest to hide a living child under a dead name and sent that child where his ledger could touch him later. I break this seal in the sight of the widow's pine." He set his thumbnail to the wax. Silas stepped forward fast, but the fourth line, not merely a singer, but a biter, lifted from leaf litter and wrapped an ankle. He wrenched free with a jerk and tore skin, and swore with admiration. Talon's mouth tightened. He had not wanted blood yet. Caleb drew his rifle up, but did not raise it, calculating again what shot mixed with proof would do to his future. Dogs whined, torches guttered, and then flamed brighter. The world narrowed, as if a hand had cupped it. Thomas took a breath that took too long, and then said the word that would move all men at once. He said, "Silas," like a challenge and like a hello to a grave at the same time. Then he stepped into full open, where the moon lit his face, and not one branch crosshatched it, and shouted for Silas by his first name. The ring of torches jerked toward him. He did not look at his mother, because he could not, and still stand. He lifted his chin. All the trap lines and counternotes and papers and pegs converged on the small circle of ground he had chosen. The pines made a round of black spokes against a white sky, a wheel that did not spin. He said, "Silas, if you are my uncle, then hear me." He let that hang just long enough to make men lean. Then he said, "Stop the dogs." Silas felt pleasure at the command because it meant boy music in his ear, a note he liked. He lifted 2 fingers and the dogs went from wire to water. He smiled like a man whose table is set. He took 1 step closer to the boy, and torchlight flared on his cheekbones. From behind Thomas, in the black that a pine root makes, a second torch climbed up out of the earth as if a hand had pushed it there. Its light showed a clean coat, good cloth, hair combed and proud. Caleb Ransom stood behind Thomas at a careful distance with that torch, smiling for the boy, and for the men, and for the page in his head, where he had already accounted for this moment. Caleb's smile held in the flare of his torch, as if confidence could burn brighter than pine pitch. Thomas felt the heat on the back of his neck, and understood the shape of the ring he stood in. Silas in front, Caleb behind, Sheriff Pike to one side with a file that could set men on fire without flame, and Talon somewhere the dark loved, stringing the last of the old law court together with gravel and breath. Ellen saw the distance between her boy and both men, and took 1/2 step that no one counted but her. The widow's pine loomed, scar catching moonlight, pegs like old teeth in a black jaw. Pike raised the file so the seal showed both men at once. Caleb's eyes tracked that red wax like a cat tracks a moth. Silas cocked his head, patient, a man confident the room would eventually tilt his way. "Read," Silas said, as if ordering coffee. Pike broke the seal with his thumbnail, the wax snapping like a brittle scab. He unfolded the paper, and Thomas heard the sound, soft but final. Mercy, half hidden, crossed herself once, not for the paper but for what speaking it would cost. Pike read, steady, words marching out into the open. Coroner's inquest convened at Mission Cellar on the body of an infant, male, full term, declared stillborn at dawn, named Thomas Silas, surname withheld, sponsor S. Glass, mother's name recorded then amended, infant subsequently placed with widow E. The ink blurred where a damp finger had once touched it. Pike swallowed and read the line about an undertaker's charge. 2 boxes ordered, 1 adult size, 1 for a child, and a notation scratched part way. Initials scraped, payment made by J. Keene. Something in the clearing leaned when those names stood together in the same breath. Caleb's voice, bent soft as velvet. "The county will not abide stolen papers, Abram." Pike did not lower the sheet. "The county never saw this," he said, and his voice climbed 1 notch, enough to reach whatever part of a man listens when his name is called in church. "Caleb Ransom, you bought a contract, you bought a file, you tried to buy a child. Silas Glass, you hunted that child in a forest. You salted with other people's fear. He folded the page once, neat as a man setting the last napkin, and tucked it into his vest where a bullet would need to go through it to find his heart. Caleb's rifle lifted the way a snake lifts its head. Ellen saw it happen, saw the small tremor in Pike's jaw, the hesitation in a man who has learned that stepping first sometimes means falling first. She did not think. She moved. The first shot cracked and jerked the night. Pike staggered. Not down. Not yet. But his body understood before his mind did. He turned on a heel polished by office floors and fired at Caleb. The shot slammed Caleb against the widow's pine. Not clean center, but enough to spin him. Enough for his shoulder to catch hard on one of the old iron pegs the tree had swallowed in its long years. He bucked like a gored bull and cursed softly, surprise turning his voice gentle against his will. Blood-marked bark and made a dark gloss in the torchlight. Silas lunged for Thomas as chaos broke open like a rotten log, scattering beetles. Talon's gravel slide trap loosed its little river. Stones hissed under Silas's boots and the ground betrayed him. He pitched sideways and reached hard to keep from falling into a limestone mouth disguised by fern shadow. His hand found a root, and his weight found Thomas. They went together, boy and man, over the lip and down onto a slope too steep to stand and not steep enough to be honest. Ellen's breath punched out of her body as if she had been struck. She threw herself to her belly and slid, palms burning, knees chewing pine needles, toward that black lip. But Talon caught her belt and braced with both legs, making himself into a hook. In the sink, Thomas caught one slow root with both hands. His shoulders screamed, and the burn at his throat roared where the earlier line had kissed him. Silas slammed into him hard enough to make stars bright behind the eyes, then clawed for his own purchase. The knife he carried skittered away and rang once on stone, a cold bell buried in earth. "Hold!" Silas barked, and too late softened the command into something like care. Thomas did not answer. He set his wrists like bolts. He knew he could not hold long. Above him, something, a loose rock, a wasted second, would decide. Pike dropped to one knee by the root edge and did not look at his own blood as it ran down his palm and made his grip slippery. He reached with the other hand and met Ellen's hands, both hot and shaking. "Take my weight," he said through his teeth, and she did, hearing the crackle of wet leaves under his boot, smelling the iron of him. He stretched himself into the sink, belly on rock, ribs against root, and grabbed the back of Thomas's shirt. The cloth tore and gave him a fistful of nothing. He reached again and got the boy's belt, leather slick, and thought of his own boy who had not lived to be 14, and set his jaw, and held. Silas found a root and clamped his forearm over it, his other hand under Thomas's knee. "I have you," he said, and he meant it, and it surprised him a little to hear that truth in his own mouth. Above, Caleb lurched, cursing, trying to wrench himself free of the iron tooth pinning his coat. Ruthie saw his hand reach for the rifle he had dropped, and she kicked it with a speed that came from years of dodging worse. The rifle slid into fern dark. Caleb snarled a word that no one taught him at his mother's table. Talon moved without noise. He tied his scarf around Ellen's waist and looped it to a root. He laid his full weight over Ellen's legs to give her leverage. Then he slid forward with a length of line he carried for mending and looped it around Silas's wrist in one cast, not to bind him, but to keep the man from losing the boy in any shift. "Don't fight me," Talon said, and Silas did not. For that breath, for that small span between falling and dying, he took instruction, like a man in a church he is mocked outside. Pike's arms trembled. He felt his own strength go wobbly, a horse after too long pull. "Thomas," he said, in a voice that broke on the boy's name, "push with your toes on my wrist, not my hand. Give me something to grab that won't tear." Thomas found the sheriff's wrist with one boot and set pressure. Pike's fingers worked like a trap-setting man's, clever even while the rest of him was failing. He got 2 fingers into the boy's belt loop and locked them there. "Now, Ellen," he said, and Ellen rose on her elbows and pulled as if the cord were tied directly to her heart. Silas felt the root slip under his arm. He regripped, and his skin tore on bark. He tasted blood, not his, in his mouth. He said, not loud, "Boy, you are not meat." It was a strange sentence for him to choose. Thomas did not know what it meant, but he heard the shape of a promise in it, and he held. Talon's line bit into Silas's wrist just enough to bite pride, as well as skin. "Hold," Talon said again, and this time the word sounded like a man pulling a name back up out of a ditch. Above, Caleb lunged free of the peg with a rip of cloth and flesh. He came around with a pistol, drawn from the back of his belt, face pale and teeth set. Pike heard the small gasp Mercy made when she saw the gun and did not look up. He could not. He was a bridge, and a bridge does not look at the river while it is being crossed. Caleb's pistol cracked, and Pike arched under the impact as if a strong hand had shoved between his shoulders. He kept his 2 fingers in the boy's belt loop. Even then, he fired back without aiming. The shot took Caleb in the upper chest, not enough to stop him speaking, enough to make his words wet. Ruthie ran at Caleb, and he backhanded her, without even looking. She fell and rolled and came up on her knees, with the parish leaf in her fist. She did not know why her hand had found that paper instead of a rock, but she held it up like a cross anyway. "Sponsor S. Glass," she cried, voice wild and clean. "You cannot buy a life twice." Caleb faltered 2 steps, not because the paper had power, but because the shaming in her voice reached something old in him he'd buried under coins. In that blink of a heartbeat, Pike moved his hand in a circle and heaved with what he had left. Ellen dragged backwards with a sound a woman makes in labor when it is all force and prayer. Thomas came up out of the sink like a fish through a hole in ice, legs kicking air, hands flailing for purchase until dirt met skin, and he clawed forward like a newborn crawling to warmth. Silas lost him and did not fall. He had one more grip in him, and he found it on a lower root, ribs slamming into stone. He lay there panting, face turned toward Blackroot, hearing his own blood as if it had a voice. Talon kept the line taut, neither rescuing nor letting go. "Choose," he said, not unkind. "What court do you want to stand in?" Pike sagged back and sat, legs folded, breath going shallow in a hurry that made Ellen's palms go cold. She knelt in front of him and put both hands on his cheeks and felt the blood slick there. "Stay with us," she said, useless words that sometimes hold men anyway. Pike tried to smile and succeeded halfway. "Mercy," he said, and Sister Mercy moved to him already weeping. He pressed the folded, blood-striped deposition into her hand. "If I'm quiet later, this speaks," he whispered. Mercy nodded so hard her shoulders shook. "It will speak," she said. Thomas crawled and put his head against Pike's shoulder, and did not worry that men were watching. Pike looked at the boy the way a man looks at sunrise, after a night he thought would not end. "Good," he said. "Good boy." Then his eyes went distant, and then focused once more, as if someone had called his name from down a hall. He blinked and tried to stand, and could not. He sagged again. "Jonah," he said, not meaning to, maybe seeing who he had failed and who he had mended for a moment. Caleb staggered toward the open, pistol lowering without him asking it to. The widow's pine loomed behind him with that old iron tooth, like a memory ready to bite again. His boot found the top of Talon's flat stones, and sent them rolling. He windmilled, arms trying to sketch a second chance out of air, and his back hit the tree. One iron peg caught the torn edge of his coat again, like the forest insisting on the same sentence. He slid down slowly, gun falling from his hand and making a dull sound on roots. His breath bubbled. He said to Ruthie, almost conversational, "I would have given you a house." Ruthie's cheek burned where his palm had marked it. She said, "You would have given me a room, sir." And there was a steadiness in her that made Mercy's throat tighten. Silas pulled himself up hand over hand, not graceful now, not performing. He came over the lip and lay on his back and looked at the shapes of the pines. He laughed once, just one bark of something like humility, put on wrong. He rolled to his side and sat up, then stood, swaying. He looked at Thomas, and then at Ellen, and for the first time, his face did not hold that pleasant readiness that had fooled too many. He looked tired and stripped of any story larger than the one moment demanded. He said to Ruthie without looking at her, "Tell him." Ruthie stood, head turned, so her hair hid the worst of her bruised cheek. "Tell him what?" she asked, steady. Silas swallowed hard enough for his throat to click. "That I made the erasure," he said. "That Jonah and I both swore to stand if paper asked, and then I got scared of a life that wasn't mine, and I told a man with money to rub out what we had written in blood as boys." He laughed dry. "We were men then, not boys." But it felt the same. Thomas watched his mouth. He saw the truth in the way Silas didn't lift his chin while saying it. He saw something else too, the way a man can be brave in confession while still staying himself in the ruin. Ellen stepped between Thomas and Silas by a half-inch. Talon let his line fall with a small shrug that said the court had heard and would set its judgment in the body of each person there more surely than any gavel could. Pike's breath thinned to thread. Mercy cradled his head and began to pray without words again, then found words because he turned his face to her, like a boy asking a teacher to recite. She prayed the simple prayer, the one for Traveler. He listened and nodded once, the movement slight as a moth. He reached for Ellen's hand and found it and placed it in Thomas's, his thumb leaving a smear like a seal. "Names matter," he said, or maybe Mercy said it for him, and then Sheriff Abram Pike, who had signed lies, and then unsigned them with blood, let his breath go as if he were laying down a heavy ledger at last. Silas looked away when Pike went quiet. He did not try to make it a show. He took Jonah's hat off and turned it in his hands, like a man weighing a bowl made by another's fingers. He held it out to Thomas. "If you want it," he said. Thomas did not take it. "It fits you," he said, and something about that answer made Ellen's chest ache. Silas's mouth twitched. "It did," he agreed. He dropped the hat on the ground and stepped back so anyone who needed to could pick it up without picking him up too. Mercy stood and wiped Pike's blood on her skirt, a gesture so practical it made Ruthie cry, because it was love disguised as labor. Mercy looked at Silas with eyes that had not been soft for him a long time. "We will write what is true," she said. Silas nodded, as if he had been told the weather. He stepped to the widow's pine and put his hand flat on the scar. He whispered something that only the tree heard. Men downslope, hearing shots and seeing no flames to explain them, began to shout and move up. Talon checked the singing lines with one touch and broke them with the quiet twist that turns a trap into string. He tied a knot in the air with both hands, a simple knot, meant for memory, nothing a ghost could not untie, and he blew on it as if cooling a pot, then tucked that invisible knot away with his other little tools. Ellen gathered the sealed file from Pike's vest and tucked it against her own ribs. She lifted the blood-striped deposition and put it beneath it. She slipped the torn parish leaf from Ruthie and held all three papers together as if they would behave better in company. Caleb made a sound like a man who has decided to make peace with pain because he cannot outlast it. He looked at Ellen, not the boy. "You should have taken the first offer," he said, an accountant to the end. Ellen said, "I did. It was a grave and a contract." He blinked, not understanding, then did. He closed his eyes like a man weary of sums. His head lowered. He did not pray. He simply went still, and then more still. The night loosened its belt by a notch. Dogs whined and were hauled back. Silas stepped out of the ring on legs that had learned a new caution. He lifted both hands and spoke to the dark where his men hovered. "Stand down," he said. "Our hunt's done." It cost him to say it. You could hear the coin leave his hand. No one laughed. Men who break off a hunt without meat learn not to invite laughter. At dawn, gray and forgiving in that way, the first light sometimes is, they carried Pike on a board that had once held someone else's weight. Talon and Ellen led, Thomas behind with his hands steady now, because there was work to do. Ruthie walked with Sister Mercy, and Mercy kept her hand on Ruthie's elbow, as if guiding a child into cold water. Silas walked at the edge of the procession. He did not touch the board. He did not leave either. Men nodded at him, and then remembered themselves. and did not. They brought Pike to town and set him in the undertaker's room, the one with the frosted window. The undertaker opened his ledger, the same one that had used the same pencil for years. The graphite worn to a stub, men chewed when thinking. He turned to the page where the line for Jonah Keene had darkened with time and grease. He pointed to a scratch in the margin where a second coffin, child size, had once been listed and then scraped. He did not meet Ellen's eyes. He did not want to see what his pencil had been used for. Mercy took the pencil from him. She wrote Abram Pike in a hand that shook and steadied and finished clean. She left room under it and wrote a small note. Witnessed by E. Keene and T. Keene. She blew on the graphite to fix it. She did not scrape anything. They walked to the mission when the board was set, and candles lit for the sheriff, who had finally chosen a side. Mercy took down the register and opened it, where she knew the scar lived. She dipped the pen, shook one drop back, and wrote a new line, where the old lie had been rubbed to dust. Thomas, son of Ellen, father Jonah Keene, deceased. Sponsor Silas Glass, present. She paused, then added in smaller script, witnessed by Abram Pike, deceased. Ruthie Vale, Talon Redbird, and Sister Mercy Hale. She let the ink sit, and then put a red thread through the page, a habit from her girlhood, meant to keep recipes from being stolen by the wind. She tied the thread in a small knot that her grandmother had taught her. Talon touched the knot and nodded once, satisfied, not as a magician, but as a man who recognizes work done with care. Ruthie stood beside the window and held up the locket Thomas had cut from the snare. She wiped its face clean with the corner of her shawl. Inside, the curl of baby hair looked like a tight storm. The initials EK were there, and the scratches that had tried to erase them. She closed it and placed it in Ellen's hand. He meant you to forget, she said softly. Ellen closed her fingers around it and felt the warm oval in her palm. I won't, she said. Silas stood by the door, like a man who has come to a house to sell something and realized he brought no goods. He watched Mercy write and winced when the pen crossed his name into a place where it could not be spun or gamed. He said to Thomas, voice lower than before, I could have been a bad uncle and a worse father. Thomas did not say it aloud, but he thought, and yet you were there when the root held. He nodded once, a movement that granted a sliver of space to stand in, without forgiving the ground. Silas accepted that narrow mercy, and did not ask for wider. They buried Pike under a cedar, where the shade comes early, and the ground stays kind. Men came that you would not have thought would come. Men who had stood easy when papers moved through rooms. They kept their hats low, and their eyes lower. Ellen said no words at the grave, because Mercy had said enough inside stone walls, and sometimes the wind prefers silence. She set her hand on the mound and felt the earth warm already. She wondered if names go into soil like water and rise again through roots and needles to be breathed by anyone who walks under green. When she went home, she carried the sealed file, now broken, and the deposition with its blood mark, and a leaf torn from a book that had grown new ink. She set them on her table like bread, meat, and salt. Thomas sat across from her and watched her hands. She said, we write right now. He nodded, and his mouth settled into a line that belonged to no other man's face. Ruthie came that evening with a kettle and a bruise, and the slow smile of someone who has decided to stay with work that hurts less than the other work. She showed Ellen how to steep willow bark for Thomas's throat, and how to wrap his wrists when they ached from holding himself above a grave. Talon sat on the step and carved shavings from a stick until he had a small pile that looked like something, then looked again and saw it was only curls of wood. He kept them anyway and fed 2 to the stove, offering them to the house like small apologies. Silas did not come inside. He stood near the fence where Jonah had once banged a gate and said something cheerful to make the stubborn wood move. He looked at the hat still lying where he had dropped it, and then up at the peg by the door. He did not lift the hat. He did not hang it. He left it be, as if to let the house decide. He turned and walked to the edge of the yard. He found one of the glass charms his men had hung low, and he cut it free with a slow, deliberate motion. He let it fall and break. The sound was small and clean. He went to the next one and did the same, moving down the trail, unstringing his old court, unmaking the forest he had owned with fear. The hounds were led away and trained again to fetch sticks and not throats. Men took down wires they had left like veins in the trees. Some traps rusted where they stood because no one could find them, now that the forest had chosen to forget. The widow's pine kept its scar. The iron peg stayed. Some afternoons when the wind was right, a wind toy made of bone chattered once, and then went shy. Thomas would stop, listen, and then go on, because a life must be lived, not listened to like a door. Weeks later, Ellen and Thomas sat with Mercy in the mission and read the line again, Thomas, son of Ellen, and it did not fade. Mercy took a second book from a shelf, one that was not meant for town, but for memory. She pressed a leaf between its pages, a scrap from the undertaker's ledger, saved by a hand that could not throw away proof. The scraped initials barely showed, a ghost under pencil sheen. She touched them with a fingertip. "Watch closely," she said, voice gentle, turning for a moment not to the room, but to you who have stood through blood and rain and paper and breath. For this is the leaf that tells why men hunted a forest and why a boy's name needed to be written twice. See whose letters were carved off, and you will know who feared truth most. The page settled, and the book closed with a sound like a door politely shut. Summer came on with heat that hummed. The Kiamichi breathed easier. Ellen planted what she could, and Thomas learned the slow dance of a field that would not be hurried by hunger. Talon went and came the way seasons go and come. Ruthie found steady work that did not require her to ink over another woman's name. Mercy's gray streak widened, and her laugh came back into the room before she did. Silas moved like a man on thin ice for a while, and then like a man on a road he'd never tried before. He kept his men, some of them, and sent others on their way with pay, and one sentence that was not a threat. He did not hunt people again. He would stand sometimes under the widow's pine and lay his palm on the scar and speak to no one in particular. On a night when the air cooled fast and the stars stepped close, Ellen and Thomas saddled the mule Jonah had loved and rode out to the ridge where the quicksand had once burped up a silver spur. The ravine had dried at the edges and greened at the lip, as if the land had decided to forgive itself. They set small markers where the snares had been, not warnings, not boasts, just little stacks of honest rocks. They left a lock of hair from the locket at one stack, and Ellen tied the locket's empty chain on a twig where the sun would touch it at noon. She watched it glitter and did not feel robbed. Thomas took Jonah's hat off the kitchen peg, where it had ended up, and set it on the fence post by the gate. He liked the way it looked there, guarding both inside and out. They did not speak much on the ride home. Words had done their share. At the gate, a wind stirred that toy made of bone hung in a far balsam. It clicked once, twice, like teeth counting names, then grew quiet. Ellen did not look back. She did not need to. The forest had learned their names, and they had learned the forest's. In the distance, a bell from the mission chimed the hour, and a soft voice said a prayer, the way a woman speaks to a stove at dawn, to wake it kindly. Some records go on speaking even after the ink dries. Some ledgers keep their scraped corners like scars, and some pages bloom names again, like spring sap pushing into old wood. If the ledger speaks again, you'll know which page to open first.